So the governor's office put out a mandate that said recommendations for police reform or reinvention were due to the state by April 1st, or cities stood to lose funding from the state. So, with 3 days to spare, the mayor's office did release their set of recommendations and left very little time for the public to view it, to comment on it in order to incorporate any changes. Even the Buffalo Common Council was left with little time to discuss it before deciding whether or not to vote it in and submit it. And throughout that, the Police Advisory Board um, was sort of left out of that process. Would you explain that to us a bit further?
So the mayor's office formed the task force in September and appointed their own members of that task force. No one from the board was appointed to the task force. There were, however, there was at least one representative from Free the People Coalition, and that coalition did have our voices represented on it from the board. So in that vein, there was some sort of relaying of the board's perspective to some degree, but the board itself was not a part of it. As you said, the mayor's office released the draft resolution on March 23rd and gave until that was a Tuesday, gave until Friday at 11 for public comment, and then released the finalized report sometime end of day yesterday on the 1st, and it was an 82-page document, not the 2-ish page document that was released for public viewing during the public comment period.
And did this 82-page document come anywhere close to the set of recommendations that your organization would have provided?
So I think we would like to know, so the original draft resolution did not. We were able to review the finalized document that was submitted to the governor's office, and there are some commendable recommendations within it that we would like to note. A few of our recommendations that were ultimately incorporated include performance evaluation, the agreement to negotiate with the PBA, Police Benevolent Association, which is the union of the BPD, to negotiate performance evaluations into the union contract, as well as the residency requirement again, which was in question. And there were some additions made to incorporate into the use of force policy that correlate with some of the things we called for in our report of recommendations last June 2020. And so briefly, some of the ones they're looking to incorporate are a duty to preserve human life, a clearer prioritization of de-escalation, and language that encourages viewing use of force as a last resort as opposed to a continuum. Slightly different language than what we recommended in our report, but in the same vein of what some of the things we called for. Dani, I think you have some things you'd like to note as well before we comment on some of the things that are still missing.
And there's an executive order that was created that is actually supportive of people who have been affected by the criminal and justice system. There is an executive order that changes the language for people who have been incarcerated from being referred to as ex-offenders to returning citizens. And there is that supportive ban the box because unfortunately, when there are questions on employment applications and housing applications that ask about a person's record, unfortunately, that eliminates people from being able to attain gainful employment and housing and some of our basic needs. So the fact that that is something that was in the reform agenda, and it definitely correlates to the creation of the and the actual launch of a LEAD program. This is something that was brought up in June of 2020, as well as is included in the, I believe the title of the section is like moving forward. So kind of like even like future recommendations and policy reforms that will be implemented in the future. The thing is, although it's great that LEAD, law enforcement assisted diversion, which is a program that it's an initiative that's being led right now by Tanvir Pert and Andrea Sullivan and from representatives from different organizations from around the city. This is an initiative that was it was actually proposed back in 2016. And this is something that very often in movement work and in policy recommendation with policy recommendations and initiatives, things can take time in order for them to be implemented. But I myself was part of that leadership team back in 2016 that was proposing LEAD. So the fact that we're in 2021 and LEAD is directly related to the reason why people are incarcerated in the first place. LEAD reduces the amount of time, the opportunities in a sense for people to be arrested. So for people who are dealing with issues of poverty and who are dealing with issues of addiction and who unfortunately we're living in a moment where in a pandemic where people are really suffering, there's a direct connection between having a program that will reduce the amount of people being arrested, especially for low-level offenses, with them even having a record in the first place. So although it's great that it's being supported, it would be nice to have a timeline as to when it would be implemented, because we're going on 5 years.
In that vein, I think that was sort of the theme throughout and segues really nicely into some of the other issues that we did, the gaps within the report. I think the theme with a number of the recommendations was lack of detail in terms of things like timeline or detail in terms of laying out specifics about how certain policy components intersect, or simply just not going far enough in terms of creating greater accountability. So for example, independent oversight, which is one of the big things that we've called for over the course of the last year and provided detailed recommendations on in June 2020 and have advocated for since, is virtually missing. So the recommendations note moving the physical location of internal affairs as an effort to increase independence of internal affairs or perception of independence. They also call for recommendations in the mayor's report around increasing the Commission on Citizens' Rights and Community Relations community work through an increase in community surveying and reporting on survey results to the BBD and to the public. So, there's nothing wrong with those two things, but those two things barely scratch the surface of addressing the issue of independent oversight. And they also don't touch on creating a more robust oversight model that actually independently tackles investigations and policy reform. Another thing that's missing, and specifically in relation to use of force, from our recommendations from last year, is a component on detailed data collection and evaluation mechanisms in the use of force policy around both de-escalation and types of use of force and data related to that. So the mayor's report does detail the intention to purchase, or it's not clear if it has been purchased, but software that is going to allow them to more effectively collect data and make it available to the public through reporting processes. that's great, but again, they don't detail, what they're going to be collecting data on, that they're not already collecting data on, and how that connects to some of the other recommendations. And those kind of details matter because that's how you create accountability for getting these things done to the public. And then I think, the other big thing, two most recent big things we've advocated for are around BOLA wraps and mental health diversion. So the report touts increase in use or potential use of BOLA wraps and tasers as more low-level options. They I think prefer not to use the term weapons, but they're ultimately weapons. We put out a report of recommendations in January 2021 on BOLA wraps, and specifically recommends carefully collecting data, releasing that data both to the Police Advisory Board and the Common Council, and allowing adequate time for review of that data and the reports before the Common Council makes any decisions around budgetary decisions around expanding the BOLA wrap, use of BOLA wraps outside of the pilot. So that's not incorporated into the recommendations at all. And then lastly, mental health diversion, and I'll leave that to Dani.
Mental health diversion, when unfortunately, when we see people who are dealing with mental health issues of mental health, who very often are more of a threat to themselves than anybody else, for officers to be for officers to be present, especially when responding to people who are having mental health episodes, it could potentially not only exacerbate what is happening with the circumstance, but it could also end up causing the person having the mental health episode even more harm than what they're already going through. So in order for people to be as to be treated as whole as possible, for there to be as I want to say as little want to make sure to phrase this the right way, but for people who are trained in mental health, who are mental health counselors, who are trained in order to be able to respond to people who are really dealing with some serious mental health or mental hygiene concerns, to not have police responding is something that will be of benefit to the people who are dealing with the mental health episodes and for our communities in general.
And just briefly on a policy level with that, though the report talks about their co-responder model, the behavioral health team that the mayor's office instituted, clearly that doesn't go as far as what we've recommended and Dani just described. On top of that, the recommendations don't detail how the city plans on working with the county, with Central Police Services, 911, to expand the diversion pilot that's being piloted right now. So these are some major gaps.